continuation of what we discussed last time. The interaction of philosophy and Jewish life in the last days of the twilight of German Jewish life on the eve of the Second World War. And last time we looked at Franz Rosenzweig, and as I mentioned last time, his colleague and collaborator over many years, I wouldn't say many years, but certainly for about a decade, Martin Buber was very much his elder, but also his follower, successor in other ways. Buber was, as far as the realm of Jewish adult education is concerned, was very much a disciple, a kind of successor to Rosenzweig, even though he had already established himself as a major philosopher and scholar, even before Rosenzweig ever made contact with him. But the turn toward adult Jewish education, adult education in general, was one of the influences of Rosenzweig upon Buber. It's one of the issues that we're going to look at this time tonight. So they were very much, they were contemporaries, they were colleagues, and one of the points that I made last time is that the great Bible translation project that they undertook together, that was begun in the early 20s, was not completed by Rosenzweig but by Buber. And really, by the time that they got underway, after they had already established the direction of the kind of project that they were going to undertake, Rosenzweig had already begun to experience his debilitating paralysis that ultimately took his life very early. So Buber worked with him in the early years, but ultimately took over the project of the Bible translation into German. And I think I did mention this last time, in contrast to the kind of German Bible translation that Moses Mendelssohn had undertaken in his time, 100 years prior, which was intended to acquaint Jews in Germany with proper German and to act as a kind of segue into German culture. The translation project of Rosenzweig and Buber was just the opposite. It was intended to provide the Jews of Germany, who had already become, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, quite assimilated into German society, losing touch with much of their Jewish cultural heritage and linguistic and traditional knowledge. It was intended to provide them with a sense of the foreignness of the biblical text, to translate the Hebrew with a tinge of the alien, with a sense of a Hebraic diction that gave the reader a sense that this was not a German text. They had to re-engage it as another cultural heritage that was theirs. All right, so this is a partnership that spanned a number of different areas: philosophy, translation, and, as we'll see tonight, adult education. And really the bridge between all three was very direct and immediate for both of them. So we're going to launch into Martin Buber tonight. And as you see from the dates, as you may recall, Franz Rosenzweig died in 1929, very early. And Martin Buber, by contrast, lived a long life, right? He lives from 1878 to 1965. He lives to not only survive the Second World War, but to flourish and to enter into a whole second career in Palestine and ultimately Israel after the war, and to become a celebrated figure, a kind of hero, cultural icon in Israel by the time of his death. A very, very important figure in many, many respects. So I'd actually like to begin with a story, and this is a story that actually is not directly about Martin Buber, but very much connected to the story that we're telling tonight. And it's very much tied into the whole question that is at the sort of the headline of both of the evenings last week and tonight, namely the question of spiritual resistance to the crisis of the moment, whether German Jewish assimilation in Rosenzweig's time or the actual external crisis of National Socialism in the 1930s in Buber's time. Now the story, it actually has to do, as I said, not with Buber, but with one of the survivors of Theresienstadt. Okay, often known as the Theresian concentration camp or ghetto, and a fellow by the name of Zeev or Wilhelm Scheck, who later devoted his life after the war, after he survived the war, to documenting the life of the Theresian camp. And immediately after the war, he founded what was known as the Documentation Project to collect testimonies and materials from Theresienstadt, and a year later founded another project, another association of Theresian prisoners that later was known in Israel as Beit Theresienstadt, the Theresienstadt House. It was a cultural institute for survivors and the collection of testimonies and documentation. And he actually traveled around Europe collecting materials that were at all connected with Theresienstadt and bringing them to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And Zeev Scheck was asked years after the war to recall one of the most memorable moments, one of the most actually positive experiences that he took with him from those dark days in the camp. And his answer was one of the most stunning stories, and I'd like to share that with you. It's actually not on your handout. I'm just going to read it to you. The first such memory, he answered, was the 6th birthday of a child. On that day, according to German orders, the child had to put on the yellow star. At the mother's request, I carefully explained to the child the meaning of the symbol. I told him of the wars of the Maccabees, of the shield of David, of the blue-white flag, which some of you may know actually was developed already in the 19th century, of the diaspora which turned the symbol to yellow and made it a sign of mockery for others, and of the coming liberation, far from the diaspora and the ghetto, and of the future renewal of life. The eyes of the child who had been brought up in assimilation lit up with understanding. The unfathomable heroism of individual Jews, like Zeev Scheck, seeking under the shadow of death to instill in others an inner strength for the present and an abiding faith in what he calls here the future renewal of life, calls to mind what a colleague and disciple of Martin Buber, a fellow by the name of Ernst Simon, we're going to talk about it also a little bit tonight, he referred to this mentality, this way of thinking, living in the darkness of the present, but believing in the renewal of the future, as the prophetic way of thinking. The prophetic mind that is pessimistic about today and tomorrow, but that is optimistic about the day after tomorrow. It speaks both in the voice, of chastisement and of consolation. This, says Simon, is precisely the kind of spiritual resistance, the very mentality that allowed Jews to resist inwardly to the evil all around them. And in a now famous essay, initially called Jewish Spiritual Resistance in Nazi Germany, and later renamed Jewish Adult Education in Nazi Germany as Spiritual Resistance, Ernst Simon, who, again, as I mentioned, was a colleague of Buber's already in the 20s and 30s, he was an old teacher in Rosenzweig's Lehrhaus, rejected the view of those who later saw in the camps and the ghettos nothing less than the utter annihilation of the human spirit, from which no spiritual nobility could possibly be imagined. And this was actually the take of a scholar, I think it was H.G. Adler, who wrote a documentary history of Theresienstadt, and who provided a very negative view of the cultural life that went on in the camp. Arguing that ultimately this was nothing but a shadow life that was intended to provide a kind of the facade of some sort of decency that the Germans could then show off when the Red Cross came to visit. Right? So in contrast to this view of Adler and others, Simon, in this essay, Jewish Spiritual Resistance in Nazi Germany, wrote that the efforts of people like Scheck and leaders like Leo Baeck, Rabbi Leo Baeck that I mentioned last time, who was a major rabbinic figure in the liberal camp, who was one of the last shepherds of German Jewry in that last period, and who was himself a prisoner from 1943 on in Theresienstadt. The efforts of those leaders, right, is nothing less than spiritual resistance of the highest order to the human brutality of the National Socialist tyranny of the time. And in fact, just as long as we're mentioning Leo Baeck, he was offered on numerous occasions throughout the early 30s, or throughout the decade of the 30s, to emigrate to London, to the United States, to Palestine, and he refused. So long as, he said, there was a minyan, the smallest possible quorum of Jewish community in Germany, he was to remain with his flock. And he remained with them, and ultimately was imprisoned in Theresienstadt in 1943. And he continued in the camps to teach the same way that he taught throughout the 20s and the 30s. He continued to teach both to the Jews and, by the way, to the Christians who were imprisoned in the camp. Because if you recall, all you needed was one Jewish grandparent to qualify for imprisonment as a Jew under the Nazi dictatorship. And so there were many Christians there too, and he taught and dignified the life as far as he possibly could, and ultimately survived the war and moved to London. The true inspiration, however, for the idea of Jewish adult education as spiritual resistance was not so much Simone or Beck as Martin Buber, the great Jewish existentialist philosopher whose writings both before, during, and after that crisis earned him the reputation of one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of the modern period, if not of all time. In the Jewish world, however, Buber's greatest legacy is not as a philosopher, at least not directly as a philosopher, but as an educator. In fact, the Institute for Adult Education, which is still alive and well at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, was founded by Buber after his emigration to Palestine in 1938. And he founded the Institute for Adult Education in order to bring the first-class university-level education out of the walls of the university to the people in the land. And he gathered a coterie of teachers who went across the country, from Moshav settlement to Moshav, from Yishuv from kibbutz to kibbutz, and teaching the farmers and settlers, giving them a taste of the learning that they didn't have from not being in those urban centers. And that was the beginning of an adult education movement in Palestine, one of the very few to exist at the time around the world. So he founded the Institute for Adult Education in 1938. He also founded in 1949 what was known as the Seminar for Adult Jewish Educators, which was set up in the year after the founding of the state in order to train educators to help with the cultural assimilation and cultural adjustment of the numerous immigrants into the country in those early years of the state. And so this was a massive project, and he not only founded this training seminar for adult Jewish educators, but he directed it until 1953. Buber's educational trajectory was itself upended and transformed forever by his own encounter with Franz Rosenzweig, his younger contemporary and his subsequent colleague. By the time Rosenzweig had established his Freies Jüdisches Lehrhaus, the Free Jewish House of Study in 1920, that we talked about last time, Buber had already made a name for himself as an outstanding lecturer, both in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. He had already traveled the gamut lecturing to Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. But in 1921, Rosenzweig had the brilliant idea to capitalize on Buber's reputation and his mastery of Jewish texts to bring him into the Lehrhaus circle. And he took a trip to Heppenheim, which is the place where Buber was living. It's nearby Frankfurt, so very convenient to where Rosenzweig was active at the time. And he took a trip with his wife Edith to visit Buber and to try to convince him to teach for the Lehrhaus. And this was actually Ultimately, although it was a major sort of transformation for Buber as an educator, it was in fact an opportunity that he seized upon. Buber at the time, in the early 20s, was working on the composition of his Ayin Dao, his philosophical masterpiece of dialogical philosophy, philosophy of dialogue. And it was in those moments of his composition of Ayin Dao that Rosenzweig came to him. And this was an opportunity for Buber to take this philosophy of dialogue outside of the realm of philosophy and to bring it into practice as an educator, right? Because the hallmark of a Lehrhaus that Rosenzweig insisted upon after he abandoned the earlier Academy for Jewish Wissenschaft was precisely to have a kind of intimate interaction between the teacher and the student. A meaningful dialogue that wasn't fixed or set in stone in any kind of firm and inflexible way. And so Buber saw this as an opportunity to take his philosophy and to put it into practice. And his early classes became legendary at the Lehrhaus. The first one was his series of classes known as Religion as Presence. And this was actually a series of lectures that formed sort of the foundation of his Ayin Dao. They were basically the Ayin Dao in progress as he was working on it. And he was sharing it and talking about it with the students. The other major seminar that he taught that first year in 1921 was a class called The World of Hasidism. And already in the first decade of the 20th century, Martin Buber was engaging in a massive project to bring the wealth of the spiritual mystical tradition of Hasidism back into the consciousness of modern Jewry in Western Europe. And he was engaged already in those early years in translation of those texts, the stories of the Baal Shem Tov, tales of the Hasidim. Some of you may know about these books, and continue to translate in the 20s and 30s as he was teaching at the Lehrhaus. Now, the interesting sort of aside in all of this is that Buber, up until that point, was a famous lecturer, but had never really engaged in that kind of give and take between teacher and student. He was still a son of the formal German lecture style. And one of the things that Rosenzweig took upon himself was to instruct, to teach Buber how to teach in a more informal fashion. And we have this wonderful letter that Franz Rosenzweig writes to his wife Edith in 1922, where he takes a certain amount of pride in a certain amount of credit in Buber's own transformation from an outstanding lecturer to an outstanding teacher. And that initially, when he first visited him in Peppenheim, he tested him. He said he wanted him to give him a sample class on Hasidism. And Buber, he said, gave him a kind of clumsy presentation. And after working with him and teaching him and training him, he turned Buber into a master teacher. So this is a point of pride for Rosenzweig. Now, as important as the Lehrhaus experience was, the real turning point for Buber as an educator occurred after the ominous rise of National Socialism in Germany in the 1930s. And really one has only to recall just some of the major developments immediately after the rise of the Nazis to power to see why Rabbi Leo Baeck, for example, very prophetically announced to an assembly of German Jewish leaders in 1933 that the 1,000-year-old history of German Jewry has come to an end. Just from that one year, those first few months of Nazi rule, some of you may be familiar with. I'm sure most of you, not all of you, are. April 1st, 1933, is the famous day of the Nazi boycott of Jewish businesses. Just 1 week later, April 7th of that year, the Nazis passed a law for the restoration of the professional civil service, prohibiting non-Aryans from the civil service, which led ultimately to the dismissal of Jews from their positions as educators, judges, in the public schools and universities, judges, government officials, employees in the public sector, April 25th, 1933, they passed a law against the overcrowding of German schools, expelling Jewish students universally from public schools in the country. And this created a major crisis of education in for the German Jewish community, how to provide for the education of all these children. Many of them turned to the pre-existing Jewish schools, the private schools that existed in the country. But many new ones had to be established. I'll turn to that in just a moment. May 10th, 1933 is the infamous day of book burning by Nazi students in 34 universities across Germany. So this was a period that grew dark very, very quickly. Buber's response to these events was immediately, almost exclusively focused on education. For the Jewish children expelled from their public schools, Buber worked with the German Jewish communal authorities to establish alternative Jewish schools, and he wrote up his own curricula for these schools. Although in this case his efforts were not so successful, there was still his emphasis was to focus on the Jewish cultural heritage, whereas the leaders of the German Jewish community, Otto Hirsch and others, were more focused on trying to preserve some sort of a semblance of that German Jewish symbiosis, and to continue to teach, at least in those Jewish schools, something of the what German thought and culture has contributed to Judaism, and what Jewish thought and life has contributed to the German society. So in that respect, he was not necessarily so successful. But he wrote on the need the urgent need to provide for the children a sense of direction and of identity in these times. And the first quote on your handout is a piece that he wrote in the Jüdische Rundschau, Jewish paper from the time. And as you have it there, this is Roman numeral 1, number 1. He wrote that children see what is happening and are silent, but at night they groan in their dreams, awake, stare into the darkness, The world has become unsafe. The soul no longer finds its way into the world. It becomes hardened and callous. Parents, teachers, how can this be avoided? What is to be done against resentment? I know of nothing else but this, to bring something unshakable into the world of the child. And Buber, to his credit, really resisted any efforts to emphasize a kind of counter-racist ideology, what he calls a sort of Völkerbildung, this almost racist education that emphasized the Jewish race as opposed to the German race. And he emphasized that our Jewishness should be identified in positive terms, not in negative terms, how we differ from as a race, but what we contribute as a people. For their adult counterparts, Buber was far more successful in his efforts toward Jewish education, and really on two fronts during these years. He established, first of all, the Central Office for Jewish Adult Education. For the German speakers among us, I know you're out there, the Mittelstelle für jüdische Erwachsenenbildung, which is located in Frankfurt, for which he served as director from its founding in 1934 until his emigration to Palestine in 1938. And in addition, on November 19th, 1933, alluded to this last time, Buber reopened the Frankfurt Jüdisches Lehrhaus that Rosenzweig had started, and then it closed after Rosenzweig's death in December 1929. In his address on the opening of the Lehrhaus, which he entitled Our Educational Mission, Buber reflected on the growing uncertainty over the future of German Jewish society, while proposing that the only antidote to tyranny was for Jews, and especially the assimilated Jews, to turn their gaze back to Judaism. Right? And this next passage that you have is from this very important essay, Our Educational Mission, right, that he gave on the reopening of the Lehrhaus. Number 2, let no one ask for which country we wish to educate people. For Palestine, if it may be so. For any foreign country, if it must be so. For Germany, if it can be so. So let me ask you, why this precise language? For Palestine, if it may be so. For any foreign country, if it must be so. For Germany, if it can be so. What is the subtle difference that he's trying to tease out with these verbs, these auxiliary verbs? Yes, in what sense?
Well, I think he's saying Palestine first, if I understand.
Yes.
It's not clear to me whether it's Palestine or Germany. But he still has, he said, if it can be so, he just assumed that Germany, which further boggles my mind.
Yeah. Well, he starts out by saying, for Palestine, if it may be so, right? Which would suggest a desire and uncertainty. Exactly.
Why would that be uncertain, though, in Palestine? I would think that would be certain.
Well, the question is how long the Germans would permit immigration. There was uncertainty in that respect. First of all, how long all this would last was very much uncertain. Not everybody was as prophetic as Leo Beck to say that the chapter has ended, right? The chapter of German-Jewish experience. But at the same time, people were traveling back and forth, but it wasn't yet clear how long that would last. So Palestine, if it may be so. Any foreign country, so you might say, as uncertain as it was, that Palestine would be the optimum choice, right? For any foreign country, if it must be so, right? If it must be so.
So that's the second choice.
Yeah. Right. So you might say as a compulsion, or as a forced solution. Okay. To go to another country, to follow the trajectory of all previous cases of Jewish immigration, to go to the nearest place of refuge, right? How did Jews? Why did more Jews ultimately end up in North America than in Palestine? Because they follow the trajectory of previous emigrations. They went to the place that offered the best opportunity for stability and security and economic and social tolerance. So in order to move to Palestine at the time, you had to have some sort of ideological leaning. If you were simply looking for security, your tendency would probably be to go to America, right? But for Buber's perspective, that would be a sort of a forced solution. But then he says, and for Germany, if it can be so, right? It wasn't yet clear. What's that?
To be idealistic about it.
Yeah. So what do you mean by idealistic?
Well, that's where his heart is, I think, and that's, I don't know.
Well, so he's not yet ready to abandon ship, right? Not quite ready.
I think the situation in Germany at that time was that bad.
Yeah.
And yet he felt German.
Yeah.
And he wants to not give up any possibilities at all, but he's not optimistic about it.
What year are you talking about?
So this is still 1934 when he writes this.
Right, so there's no benefit of hindsight.
Right.
They didn't know how bad was gonna get. For all they knew, National Socialism could have been overthrown in Germany, and it would have ended.
Exactly.
That's a possibility.
Exactly. And so if for Germany, if it can be so, this education is necessary for wherever we end up. Right? This is the crucial point. That's what he says in that very next sentence. Right? There is one image, one goal, one education, no matter where we ultimately find ourselves. Right? And then he moves on, and he turns to the question of the necessity of turning our gaze back to Judaism. He says the present crisis, so this is the second paragraph of number 2, the present crisis has seized us with both hands and turned the eyes of all German Jews to Judaism. Where this was, and this again is a very important clause, where this was still necessary. Right? Because it wasn't for all German Jews that this return to Judaism was necessary. There were many Jews in Germany that had retained their traditional Jewish heritage, that remained both conversant and very much intimate with their Jewish traditions. But for those for whom it was still necessary, they had to turn their gaze back to Judaism. What we must now know, he says, is whether we are walking the path to Judaism in truth. In our history, he says, hardship has always been a reviving power. It is not the worst thing that our starting point, the starting point of this adult educational movement, is hardship and compulsion. What we must do, he says, is make of it freedom and a blessing. Right? So to take the horror, the nightmare, right, and to turn it into something dignified, like with what Zev Shek did with the child who had to put on the badge for the first time, to fill him with a sense of pride in what the Jewish star actually meant, right, and a sense that there will be a renewal of the future in time to come, right. In a separate address at a conference that he convened, a conference on Jewish adult education in May of 1934, which he called Education and Worldview, Buber envisioned the moment of crisis as precisely what allows adults to become open again, as in their youth, to new ideas and new directions. And this is an interesting point that Buber, an educational belief that he had, that as you grow older, your views of the world become encrusted, they become crystallized, they become more fixed. It's harder to change your orientation to the basic ideas and goals of life. And Buber's contention was that it's precisely in times of crisis, these breaking points, when people experience a kind of second youth, an opportunity to question their most cherished assumptions, and to think again, and ultimately to become educable again. And this is his real belief, ultimately. This was the moment for adult Jewish education. And this is actually your passage number 3 at the bottom of that first page of the handout. In this age, he says, again, this is from Education and Worldview, in this age, indeed, many who before seemed wholly crystallized, that is, encrusted and stuck in their ways, have obtained a second youth, a crisis youth. Direct action, he says, rules the hour, and one has no time to lose. The subject of study is not determined by any universal principles. What is decisive here is our present situation. It alone furnishes the criterion for selection. What the man who shall withstand this situation, what our growing generation needs in order to withstand it, that and nothing else is the educative material in our hour. Right? It's an extraordinary statement of the idea that what we need to address here is precisely the issues that are burning for the people in this time. Right? And as we'll see as we go forward, a lot of what he did and what he published, what he taught, was precisely oriented at what he thought people needed in that time. Right? Not a sense of what it means to be a well-rounded Jew in every respect, but what you need in order to withstand this moment in the present situation. In the companion paper that Buber wrote, companion that is to this that address, Education and Worldview, which he called Teaching and Deed, a paper that he delivered at the Lehrhaus that same year, 1934. Buber declared as follows. This is turn over the sheet, number 4. He says, just as organic life is transmitted from parents to children and guarantees the survival of the community, so the transmission and reception, the new beginning and new birth of the Spirit goes on uninterruptedly. So there's a physical continuum of generations, and there is a spiritual continuum, right? But at the same time, right, the fact that we have sort of a difference of the generations in age, in the biological transmission, right, or continuum, doesn't necessarily mean, right, that age gap has to exist in the spiritual transmission. The teaching, as he calls it, the teaching generation and the learning generation. The learning generation could be of the same age as the teaching generation, right? But it's a spiritual rebirth. It's a spiritual birth of the Spirit, or rather, birth of the Spirit. And here again, so the second paragraph of number 4, in this crisis of humanity, in which we stand at the most exposed point, the diaspora cannot preserve its vital connection, which has so long defied history's attempt at severance. That is to say, no matter how many times history has threatened to upend, right, our continuity in the diaspora, right, what we cannot do without at the moment, right, or sorry, we cannot preserve that diaspora any longer without recognizing and renewing the power the teachings possess, a power strong enough to overcome all corroding forces. So again, very much like Rosenzweig, his solution to the crisis of the moment was to return, to go back to the sources, to see the sources, the traditional sources of Judaism, as a restorative power that can bring the Jews a sense of stability, of security in these times. And this is precisely, right, what this generation, his own generation of assimilated Jews, were perhaps most resistant to, right? To go back to the sources, to learn Hebrew, right? To begin again. And this is the most challenging and the most vital of these projects that he undertook, right? And this is precisely why, right? This generation, this learning generation, right? Could be of any age. It could be the younger, right, folks. It could be the older folks. And what he was working toward was to bring all of them together ultimately, right, in order to teach the sources of Judaism, right, as a source of spiritual resistance to the situation in which they found themselves. Right? And in this crisis of humanity, as he calls it, right, the only sustaining power is the power of traditional Jewish knowledge. So Buber's teaching was focused from that point forward on providing a kind of focus point on traditional Jewish sources, but he did that. He couldn't help but do that as a Jewish philosopher. You had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I find it very difficult. It's kind of up in the air. What they're doing, what he's saying, I don't understand it fully here. The problem is, these people were quite assimilated in the German culture, and all of a sudden, they were totally isolated. And what he's doing is isolating them even more. Being satisfied with that isolation, and that's not practical because the kids were thrown out of the schools.
Yeah.
They were treated terribly, not as human beings, but almost as animals, really.
So the question is, why isolate them further?
Yeah, and now you're saying to go even more, get more isolated. What good is that?
So this is a fantastic question, but the truth of the matter is we can't forget that the isolation was thrust upon them to begin with. Now, the fact that all of these children, for example, were expelled from their schools, right? There already were Jewish private schools in Germany, and all of those children that were going to public schools chose not to go to the Jewish schools. They wanted to go to the German schools. And ultimately, it was the Germans that forced upon those German Jews, right, to go to the Jewish schools. It was not by choice initially that all of those German Jews returned, in a sense, to Jewish education. But what Buber wanted to do was to make of that, right, a positive point of inner dignity and resistance to what was going on, not as a reaction, but as a positive action, right? Not as sort of as Ruth Wise described it in her early work of hers, the Jewish Schlemiel, that sort of experiences experiences history passively, is only reactive to forces beyond his control, but as someone who is active, and no matter what is thrust, right, upon him, is actively pursuing a kind of a resistance to those forces. But it's a resistance from within Judaism, right? So
In my family, I just want to tell you, it doesn't make sense. My mother
yeah.
went to a public school which was Catholic, okay, run by a priest. And she also went to Hebrew school at the same time, because they had it worked out that 3 days a week, she would go in the afternoon to Hebrew school in the same town.
That's exactly what I was doing.
That's
The
what
same
you did
day,
too.
I was going
Yeah,
in
so-
the afternoon to Hebrew school,
Yeah.
and in the morning to regular school. Then
And all of a
how,
sudden,
how more of Jewish education, how could this have helped
yeah,
the Jewish people?
that's what I
According to you.
How much more Jewish education?
Everything,
So you have to remember, for many German Jews, that there was no contact with Jewish
but they
education.
didn't recognize the Jews, so how can they recognize the education? How could they recognize the education? I mean, so this whole thing, I don't understand.
I understand.
If you're saying, how could they recognize that they even need this education? So
They wouldn't let them
what had
have-
to be a little bit receptive.
They didn't let them have
Yeah.
schools. I was thrown out of school.
Yes.
You see, there was no debate about it.
Right.
You were given the Star of David, and you had to walk in the street, not even on the sidewalk. The horses could walk on the sidewalk, but a Jew couldn't. So what you're telling, I don't know, where did you get this material?
I'm sorry, where are you disagreeing with what
I'm
I'm...
disagreeing with most of the things that you're talking about.
Explain it specifically from your experience.
First of all, we say with more Jewish education,
Yes,
you know, Buber said
yes,
that they have to be more educated more.
yes.
Fine, it's good to be educated. But the thing is this, they didn't recognize the Germans at that particular time any kind of education. They wouldn't let Jews to be educated. They were after their lives.
Yeah, no,
To validate
no, we have to remember that so this is before the period of forced deportations, right, beginning in 1938. This is still in the time when the Jews were living in Germany.
I'm talking
Okay,
about...
and they were thrown out of the public sector, out of public schools, out of the universities, out of the civil service, and so on and so forth. But they were living in Germany. Okay, and this was an effort to provide a sense of a spiritual anchor for a lost generation. So what you're saying is, from your experience, you had some access to Jewish education, but for many there wasn't any access.
No, that was before the Jews came in.
Okay,
I
so
come from-
maybe we'll talk after, just so that we have an opportunity to hear the rest of what we have here, and then we can talk more about your personal experience. I'm very interested in listening to what you have to say. What I'd like to share with you is a sense of the extent to which Buber's own efforts at teaching aroused Nazi suspicion increasingly to the point that he had to increasingly conceal the content, the purpose of his classes. In other words, he had to find a way in order to teach his students the lessons that he wanted to convey in a way that was more indirect rather than direct. So he would teach, for example, in his essay, In the Midst of History, right, which he delivered in the summer of 1933, he would allude indirectly to the demon of the hour, right, without naming it explicitly. In his essay from the same year, The Jew in the World, he described the Jewish exile as a state of homelessness in their host country, right? Again, alluding indirectly to their experience. And it was as a result of his allusion to neo-paganism that he ultimately was forced to temporarily suspend his teaching activities in Germany at the time. In 1935, he gave a lecture in the Berlin Philharmonie, and it was attended by a number of SS officers who ultimately informed the authorities, who forced him to temporarily cease his teaching. And even when he went back to teaching, it was only in smaller settings, from place to place, so as not to arouse the antagonism of the authorities. And in particular, what he did was to teach from those parts of the biblical tradition that spoke to the trauma of exile. And those prophetic books which spoke about the consolation that was to come. Right? He picked passages from the Midrashic material, Midrashic tradition, which spoke about the triumph over persecution. He taught the famous Midrash known as Lamentations Rabbah, the Midrashic interpretation of the book of Lamentations, as a way to teach, right, the idea of spiritual triumph over outer catastrophe without naming it explicitly. Right? And in a very interesting way, in 1936, we see this in a publication of a pamphlet that he put together of a collection of 23 psalms, a pamphlet that was called Out of the Depths, I Call Out to You. And this is from Psalm 130, which is the first of these 23 psalms that he put together. And again, each of these psalms speak to the experience of human despair and of distress, and of the hope, the turn for divine deliverance. And so each, again, just the material that he selected, right, without naming the Nazis explicitly, without speaking directly of the crisis at hand, he was able to address the situation in these sort of brilliant ways, both in publishing and in teaching. And he sort of, one is reminded in a sense of Leo Beck. In 1935, he issued a prayer to be recited on Kol Nidre night throughout the synagogues in Germany. And the final words of that prayer speak to this experience of the cry of a heart which cannot quite declare itself openly. And he wrote in this prayer, "The guardian of Israel," this is Leo Beck, "neither slumbers nor sleeps. Mourning and desolation overflow our hearts. Devoutly and with awe, let us look into the innermost depths of our souls, and let that which cannot be spoken sink into the silence of meditation." Right? Let that which cannot be spoken, not only because we don't have the words, but because we cannot speak it, right? For fear for our lives. Let us meditate on that which cannot be spoken. Buber later, in his later years in Palestine, described the task of that hour as one of spiritual resistance in the following terms. He writes, this is in Roman numeral 2, this is the second to last passage on the back page. "What was at stake in the work performed under such great difficulties was to oppose Hitler's wish to wear down Jewry, to give the Jews, and especially the young people, an unshakable support." When he could express himself somewhat more openly in the beginning of 1933, Buber described the plight of the Jews in Nazi Germany as the epitome and as the microcosm of the human struggle against tyranny itself. The struggle of the spirit to withstand the tensions of the age. And I'll quote to you something, you actually don't have it in front of you, but I'll read it to you. He wrote, "The Jew today," this is 1933, "is that person in our world who is most internally spurned. The tensions of the age have prepared this moment in order to measure their power against him. They want to find out whether this human being can still withstand them. And they are using the Jews as a test case." And again, in the same year, he wrote, "The tensions of the present release themselves upon the Jew. Here, the human struggle is fought out in exemplary fashion." So he viewed the struggle of the Jew at the time as the exemplary sort of epitome of the human struggle against tyranny. And in this way, ultimately, right, ennobling what was a nightmare for the Jews of his time into the possibility of resisting internally, spiritually, intellectually, of maintaining their own center of gravity as Jews, their own point at the center of who they were. Right? As he says in his address on the education of children, he says to teach them that we are Israel. Right? To remind them of who we are. That was the challenge of the hour. And in describing that urgent mission in 1934, in the founding of the Central Office for Jewish Adult Education, he articulated what he considered to be the main difference between the challenge of the hour in Rosenzweig's time and the challenge presenting itself to his own generation. And this is the last quote that you have on that handout. Buber wrote, "It is no longer a case of equipping oneself with knowledge." In other words, the task of adult education today, unlike that of Rosenzweig's day, is not simply to equip ourselves with knowledge. Right? It is a case of arming oneself for survival. And that's, of course, the source for the title for tonight's material. Of arming oneself for survival. In order that human beings survive in this way, that the spark be not extinguished. The purpose of educating the individual is to educate and mold the public as a whole. That it survive, prevail, and keep the spark alight. So these are Buber's words, and I welcome your words and your criticisms or your thoughts to reflect on this particular question, its relationship to Rosenzweig, or to looking forward to our own day. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Yes, please.
Well, I was in a ghetto in Lithuania as a child, and in a very clandestine way, the leadership tried in any way possible to try to educate, to have some sort of little schools for their children to get some education, even in the darkest hours,
Yeah.
to keep the spark of Judaism
Yeah.
alive.
What year was that?
That was 1941.
And from your experience, what were the ways in which what were the contexts in which they clandestinely tried to
Well, I was
instill this
just
in
a
the children?
child, so I just remember that I'd have to very quietly go to this Mora, this teacher,
Yeah,
and a group of us would get some sort of, a little bit of education.
yes, yeah.
Was it secular education or was it religious education?
Just education in general. I wouldn't say it was religious education specifically.
But it's interesting that you remember that it was called a morah.
Yeah, right.
So the Hebrew word for educator, a female educator, so it would be perhaps some sort of Jewish.
It would be a combination.
Yeah.
You know, I was just a child, so things are sort of fuzzy,
Right.
but I remember having to get
Yeah.
fuzzier.
And did that help?
Please, yes.
I'm a little confused by the last quote.
Yeah.
In order that human beings can survive in this way, and the spark not be extinguished, the purpose of educating the individual is to
Yes.
educate and mold the public as a whole.
Yes.
That confuses me
Good.
because how could he possibly be talking about educating the public as a whole when the public had turned its back on them
Right.
and wasn't prepared to hear anything they had to say?
So in this case, by the Jewish public, you need to read the Jewish public. Right. So in other words, to mold the public is to utilize those individuals that capitalized on the opportunity to go to these adult education sessions and to allow them to reinfuse the public of their own communities, right, with a renewed vigor. Right, so the goal there again, as he described it, this is in his essay "Teaching Indeed." He talked about communicating a spark from teacher to student, who then becomes a teacher in his or her own right, who then communicates that spark to another person. So the goal here is to infuse individuals with that sense of renewal, and then they would then turn and back to their communities and bring that spirit to them.
What good does this do when the public is
Yeah.
against you? I'm not talking about the Jewish public, but the public is is attempting to annihilate you.
You're so
And you only
smart.
have, what?
You're so smart.
Right. You would agree with the question, what's the point? What's the point?
There were only a few Jews living in Germany anyways. Most of the Jews were living in.
Well, many, by the late 30s already, most of the youth had already
Yeah.
emigrated, those who
Right,
could.
maybe at that time there were 300,000-400,000 Jews left in Germany. And what chance did they have? The public was out to annihilate millions of people.
Maybe we can have somebody here try to answer that question.
No,
Yeah.
I think you have to make a distinction
Yeah.
between physical survival and spiritual survival. Because you can teach all you want. If you're going to be annihilated physically, you may not be able to prevent that at all. But this is not for the purposes, I see it, of guaranteeing your physical survival. It is not a guarantee of that at all. In fact, that's not the intent.
No.
The intent would seem to be that if you survive,
Yeah.
you will have the spiritual armor to continue the tradition and the culture and so forth. So you have to make a distinction between physical survival and spiritual survival going forward.
I very much appreciate that point. This is an interesting point of difference between, let's say, Martin Buber and Otto Hirsch, who was more interested in efforts to stave off the disaster, the impending disaster, and was involved in trying to shore up the community in any way that he could, and help with immigration, and help with foreign alliances. Leo Baeck was sort of an intermediary figure. He was involved in Jewish educational projects, but also was engaged furiously with attempts to help ameliorate the situation physically. Yeah.
To piggyback on what Phil said, how successful was Martin Buber in doing what he wanted to do, which is to create adult education so that there's a survival of Judaism thereafter? We're facing this now.
Yeah.
And is our direction wrong? Or what should our direction be? Where should we be much more headstrong about adult education, through which then the families then teach their children, rather than think that it's the young families we have to get to? Not that age makes a difference, but are we looking at this wrong? Should we go back to Buber as the source?
Yeah.
And the only other thing, which is just a byproduct of your lecture, is I feel like it's Pesach.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it's 40 years in the desert.
Yeah.
We have to take this people and we have to have them believe in their roots and take them out from slavery to another land and hope that they will survive in the other land because there is a foundation for them that I am telling you about as God in the future.
It's a very interesting point, and personally, the way that I read both the Exodus stories and Deuteronomy is that it's very much the point of the story that the covenant, we call it the Torah, the Ten Commandments, right, was initiated outside of the land, in a state of exile, right? And the Torah itself, the Pentateuch, ends outside the land, looking into the land, almost as a reminder that no matter where the Jews go, right, whether in their current exile, their past exile, or the future exile, which Deuteronomy speaks about as well, right, that they remember that covenantal relationship, that covenantal community, that relationship to their Torah and their heritage is one that they take with them, whether they're in the land or not. And in fact, it began outside of the land. But to come back to your earlier question, where are we now, I think is precisely it's not only relevant because of the state of American Jewry, but I think precisely it offers an interesting kind of parallel with Buber's efforts with adult education in Palestine, in Israel after the founding of the state. Right, in Germany, we can dignify it with a sense of spiritual resistance and speak about its power in shoring up the spirit of the people that were affected by his efforts. But it becomes harder and harder to maintain that sense of both urgency and focus on ongoing education without the pressure, without the crisis point that he talks about, that second youth of the crisis moment. And that's why, as much as his efforts in adult education in Palestine were important, they were less noteworthy ultimately than what he did in Germany, precisely because of the fact that it was easier in Israel. In America, it's very easy to be a Jew, right? It's not necessarily easy to. It's easy.
It's easy not to be a Jew.
It's easy to pray. One doesn't feel the weight of one's ancestry. One feels a sense of ease, and so there isn't that urgency that keeps that crisis point that keeps that person focused on the most important thing.
So that means that what we have to do is to create a crisis of sorts. I mean, we have to develop a mentality of a type of crisis,
Yeah.
which may not be one that is physically threatening.
Well, it's such a yeah. Go ahead.
But around which
Yeah.
you can build a convincing argument about the spiritual aspect that will sustain future generations yourself. The future can be better than what it is, even though we don't have physical, we're not in imminent physical danger right now, you know. But
So we
crisis will be developing in the future. History tells us there will always be some kind of crisis at some point, to one degree or another. How do you create an environment where you can apply this type of theory?
Yeah.
So that it's,
So this is precisely why the crisis that Buber was experiencing and the urgency that led him to his educational mission may not be precisely the crisis that's relevant for American Jewry. We may be closer to the crisis that Rosenzweig was perceiving, a crisis of lethargy, a crisis of ignorance, a crisis of assimilation, right? An internal crisis rather than an external crisis. That may be closer to the crisis that we're experiencing.
I was just going to say, from a history point of view,
Yeah.
you were talking about the era
Mm-hmm.
from maybe 30, 33 when Hitler came in. It was a wholly different situation in Germany from even in Poland and places like that. Because if you look at Victor Klempler and the people that were living in Dresden and so forth, the type of persecution against the Jews was different in Germany than it was outside of Germany. So you could still have some kind of study going on.
At that time.
That's right.
Early on, you could. It became increasingly difficult. And in fact, Ernst Simon, in that essay on Jewish spiritual resistance in Nazi Germany, very much pointed to the fact that initially, in the early 30s, right, there were hundreds of students in the Lehrhaus classes, and there was a sense that it was just the right amount of pressure. Right, to go back to your point, just the right amount of pressure to induce a sense of urgency. But once the pressure was turned on even further, 1935 you have the Nuremberg Laws, 1938 are the first deportations, 1939 the outbreak of the war, of course, and then 41 the beginning of the extermination effort. Right, once the noose around the neck became tighter and tighter, the ability to resist, spiritually or otherwise, became increasingly impossible. So it was just the right amount of tension, of crisis, but too much ultimately was impossible. Yeah, please.
We don't have an imminent threat to us ourselves as American Jews, but there is a global threat to Jews in global rejection and criticism of Israel, and I think especially for like young people on the university, if you don't know Jewish history, and all your classmates are blaming you for the suffering of Palestinians, you're in a state where if you don't have the education, you can't really respond to it or deal with it.
So this is look, the question of historical knowledge is vital. Some people would argue that what's needed is not necessarily history lesson as much as a focus on present healing and present reconciliation. That may not be where we're at yet, but ultimately there has to be some sort of reckoning and a mutual acknowledgement of the real suffering that has been experienced on either side, in order for there to be any kind of genuine, right, mutuality between the two groups. But ultimately there has to be, I think, to dwell on that history may not ultimately be the most important thing for reconciliation. But education of the whole story is crucial, for sure. And Buber was very much involved in a reconciliation project with the Arabs of Palestine from the very beginning of his time in Palestine. There's a whole book, by the way, edited by Paul Mendes Floor, important Buber scholar, called The Land of Two Peoples, where he focuses on Buber's writings and activism with Jewish Arab rapprochement in his time.
I just had another earlier comment from, I think it was Ernst Simone, who was teaching people in tourism or something.
That was Leo Beck, yeah.
I found it disturbing that he was teaching them about living in the future and not in the moment. Because our focus today, I mean, I don't want to live for 10 years from now, or 5 years, or 2 years, or just wait and see kind of thing, because you don't know. And so I teach my children, today's the day. Like you're living in this moment. It's not the good old days, and today's the good old days. And so I can't imagine teaching my children to live in the future as if that were how they should orient how to think about the dead. Except
isn't that precisely the double vision that Simone spoke about as being the paradigmatic, prophetic way of seeing the world? You see it both in its rawness in the present tense, as well as a sense of what it can be, that messianism that propels us to create a better future. Right? That there's something about the present, the realism of the present, that isn't enough. That we
that's a better way of looking.
We require, right, that double vision, the double gaze on the present and the future, right, the chastisement and the consolation, and that ultimately is perhaps what carry them through.
Well, you can't really, if you're in a very bad situation in the present, if you're not thinking that things will be better in the future, you definitely won't survive. The people that survive all this hope that someday things will change, the Russians will march in, will be liberated, and things will change.
Very well said.
So,
Very well said.
I don't know where
Maybe we'll have some last thought or
I
comment.
don't know where I heard this. It said the future is not the past, the future is not the present, the future is not tomorrow, the future is the day after tomorrow. So you have to continue where the future will be,
But at that time, why didn't Buber foresee a little bit the future of the story when they really squeezed the Jews in Germany?
Well, thank you to all of you. It was a pleasure.